When Army Dr. Ellis Rowe broke orders to save a dying Comanche baby, he was branded a traitor by his own command. Captain Bradley, a rigid officer who valued rules over mercy, was ready to destroy a man for choosing compassion over protocol. But Ellis had a quiet weapon, his conscience, and a single act of courage that would ripple across both sides of the frontier. Just wait until you see how this story takes a shocking turn, and why, in the end, justice found its voice on the open plains. The summer of 1876 came down on Texas like a judgment. Days stretched dry and merciless across the plains, the sun not shining but scalding, pressing into the earth until even the mesquite trees seemed to wither in surrender. Heat waves shimmered on the horizon like ghosts, and the wind carried the scent of dust, sweat, and slow death. Fever didn't care for skin color or language. It stole into cabins and teepees alike, curling around babies and elders, taking whoever it chose. At the edge of this harsh landscape stood Fort Wyatt, a small military outpost stitched into the fabric of contested land. Behind its crude walls of timber and stone served Dr. Ellis Rowe, an Army field surgeon not by ambition, but by necessity. Thin from years of coffee and sleepless nights, with a sharp gaze that had once belonged to a poet and a pale scar cutting down his right cheekbone like a memory carved in flesh, Rowe moved like a man who'd long made peace with discomfort. He didn't talk much, unless it was about medicine or the human soul. His hatred wasn't for guns or battles. It was for indifference, the kind that lets suffering walk past unacknowledged. It was just after sunset when a young lookout burst through the gates of the fort, boots skidding on the dry, packed dirt. He was breathless, eyes wide with urgency, his words cracking the quiet like a snapped bone. "They're here!" he gasped. "Comanche. A woman came, alone. She's got a baby, sick." The word hung in the air like gunpowder. Soldiers looked up from their cards. A dog barked in the distance, then fell silent. The air grew thicker. Captain Leonard Bradley stepped out from his quarters, the gravel crunching under his polished boots. A tall man in his 50s, Bradley wore his gray mustache like a badge and his disdain for the native tribes like armor. He glanced toward the lookout, then scoffed, his voice a slow drawl of authority dipped in cold metal. "So, now they come crawling? Thought they were too proud to ask for help. Let them suffer in their own camps." "Not our problem." Ellis was already halfway to the infirmary tent when he turned. His voice was calm but carried a weight like thunder before a storm. "It's a baby, Captain." Bradley didn't flinch. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a hiss, but his words were meant to slice. "You step out that gate, Doctor, and you do so without orders, without protection. You help them, you stand with them. And if you stand with them, you're not standing with us." Ellis stared at him, and something ancient stirred behind his eyes. Grief, maybe, or the memory of the little girl who died coughing in his arms one saint. Lewis Winter, when the charity ward was full and the doctors too tired to care. Her skin had been pale, her body fevered, but no one had asked her name before turning her away. That kind of silence had burned itself into his bones. He had sworn never again. "Then I'll walk alone," he said simply. He reached for his worn satchel, still stained from the last case of yellow fever, and buckled it with steady hands. Around him, no one moved. A few soldiers watched in quiet disbelief. One crossed himself, another looked away. Ellis didn't glance back at the captain. He walked straight to the gate, shoulders squared, stepping beyond the fort's protection into the great bleeding wilderness. The sky was burning orange, and the sun, like a dying flame, lit the edge of the prairie with gold. Somewhere out there, a mother clutched her child and waited, not knowing if hope would come. And so the doctor walked into the twilight, not just to save a life, but to defy the line drawn in dust between compassion and command. The camp sat low in the valley of the Brazos, tucked between the river's quiet bends and the wide-shouldered plains. Beyond, smoke drifted from fire pits, carrying with it the scent of charred sage and drying hides. As Dr. Ellis Rowe stepped across the invisible line that separated his world from theirs, silence followed him like a shadow. All movement slowed. Eyes locked onto him, narrowed, wary, watchful. Women clutched their children tighter, shielding them with instinct and distrust. Warriors straightened, tomahawks hanging at their sides not as a threat, but as a silent reminder. This place was theirs, and strangers did not belong. He kept walking. The air was heavier here, thicker with history, with loss, with stories told in scars. Ellis felt it settle into his chest as if the very land was testing his presence. And then, from the center of the gathering, came a figure, tall, sharp-eyed, and young, yet aged by pain. The man had ink across his chest in the shape of a hawk, and his face bore the marks of survival, thin scars like lines drawn by the wind. "I am Kayato," he said, his English clear but taut. "This is my daughter, Lena. Her mother passed 2 sons ago. The child does not breathe right." His voice didn't tremble, but something behind it did, something quiet and breaking. He motioned, and from behind a hide flap, a girl no older than 2 was brought forward, swaddled in cloth but limp in the arms of an older woman. Her skin was flushed deep red, her little brow glistened with sweat, and her breathing, barely there, came in erratic gasps, chest rising and falling with pitiful effort. "We heard you treat even the poorest whites," Kayato added, his gaze sharp. "Prove it." Ellis dropped to his knees beside the girl without hesitation. His satchel hit the ground with a dull thud. One glance was enough. Rash across the torso, shallow breathing, fever like fire, and a strange stillness in her limbs. Rubella compounded by pneumonia, if he'd come even a few hours later. "She's in danger," he said softly. "She may not make it till sunrise." Kayato didn't blink. "Then you work now." Ellis nodded. "I need cold cloth, boiled water, and quiet. No shouting, no panic." There was no need to argue. Women scattered with silent purpose, some into tents, others toward the river. A basin appeared, herbs, blankets, and then only breath and night. He worked beneath a sky thick with stars, hands moving by memory, not sight. He cleaned her skin with willow bark extract, using what little of his antiseptic tincture he had left. He brewed tea from elderflowers and licorice root, dripped it between her lips. He wrapped her in damp linen, cooled her head, whispered steady words he wasn't sure she heard. Time blurred into rhythm. Check breath, feel pulse, wipe sweat, hope. He knew the unspoken law. The child's death could mark him as the cause, not the cure. His badge, his title, his skin, they wouldn't protect him here. But deeper than fear was something stronger, a quiet resolve that had outlasted wars and regret. This child was not a symbol, not a threat, just a tiny flame flickering in the wind, and he, with shaking hands and sleepless eyes, would do everything to keep it from going out. Hours passed. Just before dawn, as mist began to curl at the edges of the camp, the girl stirred. Her chest rose, not desperate this time, but steady. Then it rose again, and again. A cough broke the silence. Sharp, wet, painful, and beautiful. A real cough. Her body fought back. Ellis leaned in, eyes wide, waiting. She coughed once more, then drew in a breath so clear, so full, it sounded like a song carried on wind. He sat back, breath catching in his throat. For a moment he could see his daughter, Emma, curled under quilts years ago, eyes bright after a fever broke. He hadn't been able to save her, but here, in the wild arms of Texas, another child had returned from the edge. Ellis, who hadn't cried in over a decade, felt the tears well without shame. Morning came gently to the valley, filtering through the high grasses and settling like a hush over the Comanche camp. Birds called from distant branches, and a thin mist clung to the ground, as if the night itself had not fully left. Under the broad arms of a baobab tree, an ancient soul somehow growing in this foreign land, Dr. Ellis Rowe stirred from an uneasy sleep. His limbs were stiff, his shirt damp with the sweat of effort and worry. But as he blinked into the golden light, he saw he was not alone. A circle had formed around him. Dozens of Comanche stood quietly at a respectful distance, but there was no threat in their posture, no blades drawn, no scowls or mutters. Only eyes, watching, assessing, softening. The women carried bundles of herbs and laid them gently near his pack. Warriors brought bowls of clean water and set them beside him with a slow nod. It wasn't ceremony. It was something deeper, recognition. He pushed himself up to a seated position, unsure of what to say. Then an elder stepped forward. His hair was silver and tied back, his frame wrapped in a simple buffalo robe. His eyes were dark and smooth, like river stones left untouched by storms. The old man spoke, not loudly, but with a weight that settled into the bones. "Today you are not white, you are not Comanche, you are man." The silence that followed was not empty, it was full. full of something sacred, unspoken, a belonging not given lightly and never taken for granted. Then Kayato appeared beside the elder, his eyes unreadable. In his hand was a small knife, its hilt wrapped in deerskin, its blade black and gleaming, carved from pure obsidian. He extended it to Ellis without a word, a gesture older than any treaty, a symbol not of violence but of trust. Ellis accepted it with both hands and gave a slight bow, not out of formality, but out of something that felt closer to reverence. Yet even in that moment of grace, reality pulled at the edges of his mind. He glanced toward the horizon. Beyond those hills lay Fort Wyatt, and with it, the iron grip of protocol and command. He had stayed too long. The sun was already climbing. If he did not return soon, he would be marked, by law, by code, as a deserter. He gathered his satchel and gave one last look to Lena, now asleep in her mother's old shawl, breathing gently, color restored to her cheeks. Then, without fanfare, he turned back toward the fort, not knowing what he'd walk into. The gates of Fort Wyatt groaned open at his approach. Dust rose behind his boots as he stepped through. The air inside was colder than the morning. The men stiffened, some whispered. Captain Leonard Bradley stood at the center of the yard, arms folded, jaw locked. His voice cut the stillness like a whip. You treated the enemy. You left your post. You broke code and country. You betrayed the flag. Ellis stopped a few feet away, his back straight, eyes unwavering. I saved a child, sir. My oath doesn't change with borders, and my flag is my conscience. For a moment, nothing moved. Bradley's face turned a deep shade of crimson. His hand moved to his holster. Tension rippled through the camp like a brush fire. Ellis did not flinch. If this was the cost of doing what was right, he would pay it in full. But before the moment could tip into violence, a sound came from the east. Slow steps, dozens of them. Comanche figures emerged, unarmed, deliberate. They walked in silence through the open gates, bearing no threat, only a single message in their hands. At the center walked Kayato, cradling Lena. The child was awake, breathing calmly and impossibly smiling. She waved a tiny hand, and the gathered soldiers, hardened men shaped by war, blinked and looked at each other as if seeing something they couldn't explain. The same elder who had spoken before stepped forward once more. He looked at Bradley, then at the men behind him. This man is not traitor, he said. He is Bridge. He is spirit of the plains. And as the drums of morning echoed faintly in the far distance, Ellis felt for the first time in years the weight on his chest begin to lift. Dot. The sun had risen fully now, casting long shadows across the yard of Fort Wyatt as if trying to stretch light into every corner of doubt. The soldiers stood still, caught between orders and something that felt like truth. Captain Bradley, stiff as stone, had not moved since the elder's words had struck the air like arrows. His hand still hovered near the pistol on his hip, yet something had shifted in his eyes. Not weakness, not surrender, but the faintest glimmer of uncertainty. He had expected defiance. Instead, he was met with grace. Dr. Ellis Rowe stood with dust on his boots and sweat on his brow, not with pride, but with calm. Behind him, Lena nestled in her father's arms, her cheeks no longer flushed with fever, but glowing with life. The sight of her, a child once nearly lost, now blinking at the world, seemed to dull the sharp edges of even the harshest stares. Around them, a strange quiet bloomed, the kind that follows storms, the kind that waits for something sacred to settle. Bradley finally spoke, but the steel in his voice had thinned. You undermined this command. I upheld what's left of our humanity, Ellis replied evenly. If that's an offense, I accept the punishment. But the captain's words were drowned out before they could carry farther. A voice rose from behind the Comanche group, not shouted, not forced, but full. A woman wrapped in deerskin and sorrow stepped forward, holding a necklace woven from feathers and beads. She handed it to Ellis without a word. Then came another, an old man with a walking stick carved from riverwood. Then two children bringing a single eagle feather wrapped in red cord. One by one they approached him, not as supplicants, not as debtors, but as witnesses, witnesses to something that could not be erased by rank or policy. A decision made not out of rebellion, but out of reverence for life. It was Kayato who said it aloud. You saved more than a child. You showed us that mercy still lives behind uniforms. Ellis's throat tightened. He looked at his comrades. Some dropped their eyes, others held his gaze. A few even nodded, quietly, respectfully. Bradley, still as stone, lowered his hand. "There will be no charges," he said finally. "But understand this, Doctor. You've drawn a line that can't be erased." Ellis met his eyes steady. "Good. Let it stay drawn." That evening the plains came alive with drums, not of war, but of celebration. Echoes rolled across the prairie like a heartbeat rising from the soil. Firelight danced in the distance as Comanche songs lifted into the sky, carrying words the fort could not understand, but every man could feel. Ellis sat on the hill above camp, listening. He didn't need translation. Lena was alive. A bridge had been built between worlds long divided, and for the first time in years, he believed that healing might stretch farther than wounds. Below him, laughter mixed with rhythm. Flames rose, and far off in the dark, under a rising moon, the drums kept speaking, not of past battles or fallen laws, but of a future not yet written. And in that quiet, Ellis finally allowed himself to breathe.